Now let's move to elasticity of demand. Elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of demand to a change in the determinants of demand. And the determinants of demand that we are looking at are income of consumers, price of the commodity, and price of other commodities. So elasticity of demand explains how the determinants of demand, which is price of the commodity, income of consumers, and price of other commodities, how they influence the quantity of goods and services demanded by consumers. Now let's look at the types of elasticity of demand. We have three types of elasticity of demand. Number one is price elasticity of demand. Number two is income elasticity of demand. Number three is cross elasticity of demand. Let's look at them one after the other. Number one, price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of demand to a change in price of the commodity, which means how will quantity demanded of a commodity be influenced by changes in price of the commodity. How do we calculate price elasticity of demand? The formula for price elasticity of demand is on your screen. As you can see, price elasticity of demand is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. The important thing you need to know about price elasticity of demand is that it has an absolute sign, which means the answers we get can never be negative. If you have a negative answer, you remove the negative value and make sure your answers are positive. Let's look at what we call point elasticity of demand. Point elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of demand of a commodity to a change in a particular price of the commodity. So point elasticity of demand is change in quantity demanded divided by change in price multiplied by first price over first quantity. So point elasticity of demand is usually used to solve questions in OBJ. So for JAMB students, it's usually advised to use point elasticity of demand. For YX students, it's usually advised to use it in OBJ. You only use point elasticity of demand for OBJ questions. Let's look at the types of price elasticity of demand. So types of price elasticity of demand will enable us to analyze and interpret the elasticity of demand of a commodity. Number one is fairly elastic demand. Fairly elastic demand can also be called elastic demand. So it occurs when a change in price of a commodity leads to a greater change in quantity demanded of that commodity. So the coefficient of fairly elastic demand is usually greater than 1. So if you solve a question and the answer you get is greater than 1 without approximation to the nearest whole number, so if the answer you got is greater than 1, it means that the commodity has a fairly elastic demand. And a fairly elastic demand is usually for commodities that have close substitutes, which means they have alternative. Look at a diagram to explain. As you can see, the price decreased from 2 naira to 1 naira. At price 2, we have quantity 1. Law of demand, when the price fell to 1, quantity increased in greater measure to 3, which means that the percentage change in quantity is greater than that of percentage change in price. So the value we are going to have will be greater than 1. The second type of price elasticity of demand is fairly inelastic demand. Fairly inelastic demand can also be called inelastic demand, and it occurs when a change in price of a commodity leads to a lesser change in quantity demanded of that commodity. So it is meant for commodities without close substitutes. Examples are commodities that are of necessity. So the coefficient of fairly inelastic demand is usually lesser than 1. So if you solve a question without approximation to the nearest whole number and the answer you got is lesser than 1. It means the commodity has a fairly inelastic demand. Look at this diagram. The price fell from price 2 to price 1. At price 2, quantity 1 was demanded. When the price fell to price 1, quantity increased, but in a lower measure, which means that the percentage change in quantity is lesser than percentage change in price. So we are going to have a coefficient lesser than 1. Let's look at the next one, which is unitary elastic demand. Unitary elastic demand occurs when a change in price of a commodity leads to an equal change in quantity demanded of that commodity, which means that percentage change in price and percentage change in quantity change in the same proportion. So the coefficient of unitary elastic demand will be equals to 1. As you can see on the diagram, price fell from price 2 to price 1. The percentage of falling is also the percentage of increase in quantity demanded, which means the coefficient is equals to 1. Let's look at the other one, which is perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand occurs when different quantities of a commodity are demanded at a particular price. So when different quantities of a commodity, they are demanded at a particular price. So the coefficient is equals to infinity. So we can also call perfectly elastic demand infinite or elastic demand or infinitely elastic demand. As you can see on the diagram, we have our price, we have quantity demanded, we have our demand, which is infinite, which means that percentage change in price is constant, and we have percentage change in quantity. If we divide percentage change in price, if you divide percentage change in quantity by 0, you are going to have infinite. That's why we have perfectly elastic demand. The last type of price elasticity of demand is perfectly inelastic demand, and it occurs when a particular unit of a commodity is demanded at different prices. The coefficient is usually 0. So we can also call perfectly inelastic demand zero elastic demand. As you can see on the diagram, we have price, we have quantity demanded. As you can see, a particular unit of a commodity demanded at different prices, which means percentage change in quantity is 0, and we have different percentage change in prices. So what you are going to have is that you are going to have a zero elastic demand. Now let's look at number 2 type of elasticity of demand. Or before we look at the second type of elasticity of demand, let's look at the relationship between total revenue and price elasticity of demand. Total revenue is the entire income derived from units of goods sold by a firm. And the formula for total revenue is price times Q. And price elasticity of demand, it measures the degree of responsiveness of demand to a change in price of the commodity. If you look at the formula for price elasticity of demand and the formula for total revenue, you can see that price and quantity are common. All right. So now let's look at the relationship between total revenue and price elasticity of demand. Number 1 is that total revenue is inversely related to the price of a fairly elastic demand commodity, which means an increase in price of a fairly elastic demand commodity will lead to a decrease in total revenue of a producer, while a decrease in price of a fairly elastic demand will lead to an increase in total revenue of a producer. Don't forget that fairly elastic demand are commodities that have alternatives or substitutes. So if a producer increases the price of its commodities, the quantity demanded will change in greater measure, which means if a producer increases its price, quantity demanded will decrease drastically and the revenue will fall. And if the producer reduces the price, the quantity demanded will increase in greater measure and total revenue will increase. The second relationship is that total revenue is directly related to the price of a fairly inelastic demand commodity. So an increase in price will lead to an increase in total revenue, while a decrease in price will lead to a decrease in total revenue. Don't forget that I said earlier that fairly inelastic demand are for commodities that do not have alternatives or necessity. Let's use Nigeria as a case study. Petroleum products like petrol, all right, is an example of commodities that do not have alternative. Another example is electricity. If there's an increase in price of electricity, we don't have any other alternative. If there's an increase in price of fuel in Nigeria, consumers do not have alternative. Consumers will still buy, which means if producers of electricity products and producers of fuel want to make higher revenue from that product, all they need to do is to increase their price because consumers will still buy more. So that's what this is talking about. The last relationship is that total revenue has no relationship with unitary elastic demand. So an increase or decrease in price of a unitary elastic demand will have no effect on the total revenue of a producer. Now let's look at the second type of elasticity of demand, which is income elasticity of demand. Income elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of demand to a change in income of consumers, which means it explains how changes in income of consumers influence quantity of goods demanded by consumers. Let's look at the formula of income elasticity of demand. Income in economics is usually represented with Y. So YED, which means Y is income, E is elasticity, and D is demand. So YED represents income elasticity of demand, which is percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. So how do we analyze? How do we interpret income elasticity of demand? If you solve a question and the income elasticity of demand is positive but lesser than 1, it shows the commodity is a normal goods. All right, it shows the commodity is a normal good. If you solve a question and the income elasticity of demand is positive but greater than 1, it shows the commodity is an ostentatious good or a luxury good. I've explained normal goods, ostentatious goods, and luxury good earlier. Then, if income elasticity of demand is negative, it shows that the commodity is an inferior good. So this is how to analyze income elasticity of demand from the coefficient derived from your solving. Let's look at the last type of elasticity of demand, which is cross elasticity of demand. Cross elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of demand of a commodity to a change in price of another commodity, which means under cross elasticity of demand, we are looking at two commodities. We are looking at how change in quantity demanded of a commodity is being affected by price of another commodity. Now, how do we calculate cross elasticity of demand? How do we calculate cross elasticity of demand? The formula for cross elasticity of demand is given as percentage change in quantity demanded of commodity X divided by percentage change in price of commodity Y, which means we have two commodities. So a change in price of one will affect quantity demanded of the other commodity. So how do we analyze cross elasticity of demand? If you solve a question and the answer you got is positive, so if the answer you got is positive, it shows that the commodity is a competitive goods, or an example of a competitive goods is substitute. So if you solve a question and the commodity and the answer is negative, it shows that the commodity is complementary goods. Another name for complementary goods is joint products. If you solve a question and the answer you get is 0, it shows that there's no relationship between the two commodities. So this is how to analyze a cross elasticity of demand.